I'm going to essentially try to give a cautionary tale about how we need to learn from our relatives. This guy is not my relative by blood of any kind, but this guy, whether I like it or not, is my grandfather. This is Stanley Tigerman, Chicago architect. Stanley wrote a cautionary tale about the iconic heroes of the 20th century, the Chicago iconic heroes of the 20th century. So think Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, and lays out an argument that each of them dies a tragic, or each of them ends their lives in a tragic way architecturally. And the argument goes that each of them, being first-generation Chicagoans, have an internal drive that's personal to them, that is inherently about some sort of motivation that is outside of the context in which they work, and that motivation does not easily translate into the preceding generations of siblings or what are children that come after them. I think that tale is meaningful not just in the history of Chicago architecture, but is meaningful in the history of modernity, and especially American modernity, in the sense that we have kind of defined success, especially here in America, based off of two key traits, that of reason and that of utility. And that if you cannot harness any conceptual idea with those two kind of modes of thinking or modes of use, then you're pretty much at some point going to run on empty. I think that we can kind of think about that, and we can think about the kind of three pegs in which architecture stands up on, and start to find ourselves in a position that allows us to operate in a more fruitful way in the 21st century. So if the argument that Stanley puts forward is that delight is only a byproduct out of the first two in this equation in the 20th century, and that doesn't work if you're seeking delight the way our heroic figures have sought delight in their practices, I think that we can find that we're dealing with a different situation in the 21st century. And I want to essentially outline two individuals or two figures that I think offer ways into addressing how these issues stand in the 21st century in our kind of media-driven society that doesn't allow for kind of a mature advancement of one's position before it's consumed. The first individual I want to talk about is Doug Garofalo. Doug would be my architectural father. He was an architect who came to Chicago in 1987, I believe, at the invitation of Stanley Tigerman, who saw his thesis project at Yale. Upon arriving in Chicago, he quickly set up his own practice and became known well inside the circles for innovative work that kind of blurred the relationships of different camps inside the architectural profession at the time. He became internationally known by the late 90s when himself and two other young architects, Greg Lynn and Michael McInturf, essentially produced this building completely digital. This building was hailed in the press as the first digital building. So this is before any of Frank Gehry's projects that you kind of quietly associate with the digital revolution. Doug would joke that this building came more out of email than any other software, and that email is really the innovative kind of exercise in that building. Nonetheless, the press loved him, the press loved the project, and he quickly became labeled as a blob architect, or as an architect whose work was digitally sophisticated, digitally driven, was non-Cartesian, and solely about form. To make that argument about Doug Garofalo as selling him short undermines his kind of true intellectual curiosity and undermines his true gifts as a creator. These are sketches that are essentially investigations in nothing more than posture and kind of placement in space. This is an investigation in just kind of materiality, the carving of wood. Later, the work that towards the end of the office's career, starts to show this sophistication that was always there to begin with. So whether it was kind of more traditional building materials that are being kind of played up with an equal emphasis as any shape or any formal logic, or whether it was a series of kind of digital information that's being graphically portrayed in a way that became interactive or dynamic, the work tended to move out of the realm of form first. That left a lot of people confused, and it left a kind of strange situation. Anytime press came in to interview, or he was put in a position in which he had to essentially present the work, because they were always hunting for the kind of quick series of one-liners that were about a series of forms or shapes and so on, when he was much more interested to talk about architecture as a series of ecosystems, not in a kind of green, environmentally friendly sense of the word, but rather in this notion that we operate as designers within a broad range of considerations and ideas and values, and that at certain moments, certain values get played up, and other moments, other values get played up. They fight, they contradict, sometimes they agree, sometimes they're in unison, but most of the time, it's just a big mess. That kind of contradiction that's inherent in the work that was the motivating kind of interest of the office was always in a kind of pursuit for delight, first and foremost, and then would be hunting for other ways to manipulate concerns of efficiency or concerns of economy to pull off those means. I think one of the key things to think about is that this man was a producer in a time where the world is rapidly changing from an industrial, production-driven society to one of consumption. This man never stopped producing. This guy that I'm going to talk about now, T.E., was a consumer. T.E. consumed his entire life. T.E. lived a very long, fruitful life. He was born in the South, 1929, I think it was October. Moved back to Gee's Bend, Alabama, where his family is originally from, sharecroppers. Gee's Bend, you might know from essentially a lot of press that came out, largely I think in the 80s, on the quilts that came from the homemakers in the area. They had a very intuitive sense of production. He was a young child, would only talk about these in a kind of superficial way, because I don't think he ever fully understood what they were. He leaves the South, just like most other poor African Americans at this time, for the industrial North. He sets up shop at a glass factory in Pennsylvania. He spends most of the 60s in Pennsylvania working at this glass factory. He's married. He marries a younger woman. He's 30 at the time of the marriage. She's 19, I believe, somewhere in there. She just graduated high school. It's the first real stable period in his life, because that kind of period that he was living in the South as a young child, he didn't get along well with his uncle, who he spent most of his time with. There was a lot of fighting, a lot of attempts at running away. It wasn't until this period in the 60s where, while the rest of the nation is in conflict, he's at peace. He breaks his arm in an accident with the annealing oven. Glass factories have these kind of large ovens at the end of the line that essentially tempers the glass. He breaks his arm. At this point in time, he is laid off. They have financial issues, and he would joke that he just got in the car one day and drove away. He wanted to come back, but he didn't. Spends the next period of his life in New York, and I think that this period in his life is the defining period of his time. He arrives there in 1979, 1980. No, sorry, 1969, 1970. He spends the next 16 years there. He essentially starts riding the subway cars the first time they're starting to get tagged. Graffiti in New York at this time is largely a territorial dispute or a territorial art or challenge, where you tag your first name and the street that you live on. It's only over the years that it starts to grow into an aesthetic act or into some sort of investigation or challenge that's beyond that of just owning land. And this is what he found interesting, that somehow there was an intuitive sense to the way people were producing this work that he found worthwhile. He never actually did any of this work, but he saying or claimed that he was close to a lot of the people that did. The only proof that I have is this image where this is his graffiti shop. He essentially had a little spot underneath an overpass where he would sell graffiti or spray paint to artists and make a little bit of money. He leaves New York for the Southwest. He's having a lot of addiction problems at this point in his life, and by the time that I meet him, he's a totally rehabilitated man. But he essentially held up shop in this Quonset hut where he didn't do much of anything that is on record. I'm not even sure how he made a living the time that he was here. He would brag about this stuff that he would do, these kind of stone carvings that he would sit out into the desert that he essentially learned how to do from a community college. This is his first time at ever really producing anything that I know of. I meet him in 2008. So by this point, the campaign is in full mode, and I spend a lot of time at the bars just kind of watching political commentary like most political junkies. And this is where I run into this guy. This guy and I have literally nothing in common other than the fact that we're sitting beside each other often enough at the same bar. And we start to talk, and I find that his sensibility towards the world is something that I appreciate. And he had become such a kind of junkie, not just in kind of politics, but in kind of the web and blogging, that he could tie into a lot of different things, and I found that appealing. We decide that we're going to try to do something together, and it largely comes out of an enthusiasm towards the kind of political campaign. And we do this White House competition that was sponsored out of the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York. And the project's not that crazy. It's a big hole in the ground with the Oval Office at the bottom, and then you live in a mat above the hole in the ground. The president lives in a mat above the hole in the ground. The rest of us can walk around on the ground floor. We enjoyed working together, so we decided that we were going to try to find a way to keep kind of doing things. But at the same time, neither one of us had any interest in kind of doing anything in any traditional way. He's late in his life. He's in his mid-70s by this point. He was not ready to make any sort of commitment towards anything, nor was I, being a kind of young, rebellious guy. But what we decided we would do is we would essentially write down a set of rules that we found valuable to us and how we thought people need to operate in this kind of new century where the media plays such a dominant role in the way we do things and why we do what we do and how that gets kind of portrayed or evolves through time. So these are our rules. Okay. Work backstage as often as possible. He spent a lot of time with bluesmen in his life, so there's a lot of analogies towards performance in this. Embraced fictions. Essentially, he was a shady character. He had no problem lying. He'd tell you exactly whatever you wanted to hear to get his effect or get his point across. Beyond that, there was kind of a notion that came from me that we're going to do the drawing is the actual thing. If anything comes from the drawing, that's the abstract thing. And that kind of flipping of priorities or what's real and what's fake, I think, is fundamental towards how any young practice wants to operate. And I think it's emblematic in the work that we're seeing here today. Stay out of the spotlight as long as possible. And this just comes from a notion that the media will chew you up, the web will chew you up. Just stay away from it, do your thing, and be fine with your thing. And I think that this came more from his interest in kind of encounters with those subway artists from New York than anything else. And I'm not a big fan of the web, but I think it was more an issue of kind of his experience with these underground artists. And then the last thing is, once you're in the light, know when to bow out. It's the George Costanza rule. You get a good joke, step out of the room. And that's essentially the way we've operated, or the way we operated. And this is just some of the work that we've done since then. We do a lot of these houses. These are truly speculative houses. Houses that allow us to kind of hunt for distinct living arrangements and distinct formal characteristics that we can then categorize and prioritize And then if we're lucky, we can find some way of reusing that organization, or that, what Sean started to talk about, these kind of relationships of layering, to produce things that change in scale, change in scope, change in size. So this house, where the ceiling looks like a bunch of grapes with a hole cut out of the middle of them, turns into this giant community center is the best way I can describe it. It's a big concert hall with big snouts underneath it, into the ottoman that you see behind me. Thank you.